So, just to kind of catch Katie up again, the third parties are going to make the major parties have to consider issues they would otherwise ignore. So they give an outlet to people that don't have things that the major parties identify that they want them to cover. That makes it democratic. You know, it's an outlet for people that kind of, you know, allows them to avoid the more radical forms of expression, right? And it will often cause major parties to kind of co-opt. So that's, you know, as Colby was saying, that it kind of keeps them honest, right? Here's another factor that keeps political parties honest, and it is the real potential that this is more than a aberration. There may be political forces out there that are forcing a realignment. Realignment ought to scare the parties. The idea that there has been a kind of a wholesale shift in the demographics of who supports them because of some sort of issue, and they're going to all of a sudden become obsolete. You know, it was interesting with the Republican Party just prior to this most recent election. You know, they had done what they called an autopsy. They literally called it an autopsy. They did a self-study when they had lost to Obama, two kind of, you know, elections in a row, and they were wondering what's wrong with us as a party that we can't, you know, be more competitive in the national elections. Is it because we're not reaching, and some of the predictions were you need to reach out more to women and Hispanics and people of color, and that was their kind of idea coming out of those internal sessions, right? Flip it now, because the Democrats kind of got shocked. And so they're looking at the idea of how did we lose, in particular, our Democratic base, the kind of the working class base, the non-college educated, white, blue collar workers. How is it that they pivoted to essentially a New York billionaire who seems to favor kind of economic policies that are reminiscent of Reagan in a lot of ways, right? The trickle-down kind of theories, deregulation and tax cuts and being business friendly. And eventually those will kind of trickle down in the form of higher wages and better jobs. And we're going to kind of do this protectionist approach. How did the Democrats lose their base? So they're having a similar moment of crisis. Realignment should be fairly scary, and it's not just in the abstract. It's happened, you know, multiple times in our history. So again, you watched it as we pivoted from the different party systems. Sometimes a crisis would make a party obsolete, but sometimes that crisis just kind of caused a shuffling of who supports what. So again, think about the Great Depression, and think about how it caused people to go from the Republican Party to the Democratic Party, and also vice versa, right? So let's think about this. The Republicans, you know, are the ones seen as mishandling the economy, and it leads to the Great Depression. The Democrats are the ones that are seen as, with FDR, the ones that kind of come up with the solutions, okay? So in part, this explains why African Americans would go from the Republican Party, which was the party of Lincoln. Why is that significant? Freeing the slaves. There ought to be an historic identification with the Republican Party. There ought to be this idea that our safety, our well-being is kind of tied to the Republican Party. With the Great Depression, that was a catalyst, because of economics really, to pivot over to the Democratic Party. And then comes LBJ and he cements that alliance with the Civil Rights Movement, okay? So we're gonna flip African Americans, people of color, to bring them into the Democratic Party. Why do the people in the Republican Party, why does the people within the Democratic base flip to the Republicans? Well, let's go to the South, right? Again, the agrarian South, the Democratic Party is the party of the in opposition to the Republican Party. They become the party of the former Confederate states. It's almost by default, right? What ends up happening though is as you have that push to promote civil rights with a more powerful federal government, this causes the southern states and those historically Democratic voters to pivot to the Republican side. And then Nixon in particular has the strategy of let me cement that alliance with socially conservative values. You know, on some level there's racial kind of fears and tensions. that you can kind of use social values as a construct to obfuscate, to kind of hide, right? But also it is the idea that you've got maybe more of the Bible Belt there, and if I emphasize prayer in school and an anti-abortion stand and things like that, that I can cement this. So again, here it is in images. And you look as I kind of jump through time, there's the Solid South, the Democratic Solid South. It's always Democratic because, again, of the legacy of the Civil War and what the party stood for. Then you get to LBJ and you get to the Civil Rights Movement, and I'm going to flip that base. And that scares the parties. That kind of, in some level keeps them honest. Elections are, you want to think about how they communicate things. So when we, let me go to maintaining elections. You remember what that is? What happens during a maintaining election to the party in control?
Party stays in control.
Party stays in control, right? How about a deviating election? What's happening there?
The opposite party takes over.
All right, let's do this. Contrast a deviating from a realigning.
A realigning election is when the parties that exist currently, they go back to their own, previous policy, like they have a certain doctrine that they follow.
So I wouldn't say necessarily it's the party
Alright.
It's like
redefining.
the change of base.
It's the change of base, right? So,
Like they neither group feels like they identify with
Yeah, they stray away
the political
from.
party or that
well, here's what I'm saying. You could look at Trump and Trump's election as being the new normal, right? Or
It goes back and
it goes back to here's what if those blue collar workers who are feeling the economic pinch and having kind of anxiety over societal changes find that Trump isn't delivering for them, will they go back to the Democratic base, right? So when you're thinking of a maintaining, you got that one right. A deviating is where you all of a sudden go from, wait a minute, the party in charge is no longer in charge. We've gone to the other party. Why? Is it because there's a large scale kind of shift in power, or is this only temporary? Was there some sort of short intervening factor that caused us to kind of break from our political norms? Versus we've flipped. The Solid South is no longer the Solid South. It's gone from Republican to Democrat, or Democrat to Republican. What's the de-alignment?
That's when you're dependent.
Yeah, you go off the rails. Ross Perot becomes the third party, right? So what I'm trying to suggest to you guys here is, see if you can figure it out this way. You have to kind of look at elections the right way, in what it says in terms of political parties. So what do you think the answer to this one is? It's a tricky one, it's a mean one. Do political parties recruit and train leaders?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, right? That's one of their main functions, right? Do they foster political participation?
Yes.
Yes.
To get people involved.
We talked about getting out the vote, right? So, do they teach new citizens democratic habits and practices?
Not necessarily. Not really teaching them.
Yeah.
If B is true, is C true?
Yes.
Well, no.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, because new citizens would be in the political participation.
So they represent a demographic that you want to kind of reach out to. I want to get them to vote. Part of the platform might involve, not only talking about the issues but the importance of the party being in charge and the importance of voting. So this one we're having, maybe we put a pin in that. Do they organize the activities of government?
They do,
Depends
but
on
that
them.
doesn't really make mass democracy possible. You could have a fully Republican government in there.
And that's not mass.
But are they,
But that's not making mass democracy.
I mean, you
Well,
can say that they do.
what
because
do they mean by, okay, so let's look at that. What do they mean by mass democracy? We're a large democratic country, right? And we depend on mass involvement. If we're a representative democracy, we're only as good as the level of participation. So is one of the ways they make our large republic functional is by helping to kind of organize government.
You can see that because they come in with their own set of ideas and values, and they kind of organize everything to work with that.
So they have to work collectively together, right? They have kind of party mechanisms is how we get things done. That's how we're, they just had they're televising a lot of these lately where the Republicans sat down to talk about gun control and what are our plans and policies. What can we do to approach that? So that was how they worked by party to come up with, policy. Do they forge public opinion via elections?
Not really, because at that point, public opinion have already been set.
Okay. So again, when I am showing you, ooh, look at that reveal. When I am showing you, how the elections, those types of elections, what is kind of suggested in there is that the elections are communicating something to the parties. It's not the other way around, right? They're a measure of what we believe. And they basically kind of shape the parties versus the other way around. The parties are dependent on their number one function is to do what?
Get support.
Get support, to get elected. So they're going to use elections as a barometer, okay, to figure things out. So at any rate, that is all of the kind of the issues surrounding third parties and the idea of elections as communication tools. But kind of keep in mind, the test loves reform issues. It loves looking at, in what way are we democratic and in what way are we not? What are the barriers to reform and what are the keys to reform? So, you would look at the value of political parties and that they organize the election process, they unify us, they provide that vehicle for change. You would look at the idea of we're a two-party system and that has its pros and its cons. There is a role for third parties, and that has its pros and cons, but what else can we look at in terms of the role of political parties? Well, one thing we could look at is the idea of political parties used to monopolize government via the spoils system. You remember that? So what's the spoils system?
It's putting your people who are like allegiant to you in government.
Based on their what?
It's not based on merit.
Good, not based on merit, based on their support, right? So we've replaced that. One thing you can look at is that we've replaced that over time, and that on some level, has it weakened political parties? What we have now is a bureaucracy that helps get you into the bureaucracy, right? There is, and we haven't, you may have read about this, but we haven't mentioned them specifically, the Office of Personnel Management. And what they essentially do is they're a bureaucracy that creates procedures and protocols by which people get hired, get promotions, might have to, if anyone's gonna lose a job, they're gonna have kind of a role and a say in it. And it's gonna be based on merit, right to the point where, depending on the position, there is a test that you would take, a civil servant's exam that kind of, helps gauge your qualifications. So it's not based on who you know, it's based on your merit. And even the kind of the raises and the kind of the positions that you move up to are carefully regulated by this OPM, right? So that's one reform issue, that the parties no longer get to hand out jobs and they lose a tool in terms of control, but do we become more democratic as a result, right? Similarly, they are no longer handing out benefits. Literally, you studied party machines, and they'd be down by the docks, making sure someone had a place to sleep and found work eventually. And there are all these stories about making sure there's a chicken in every pot, right? That was a simple way of kind of, garnering long-term support. Well, we're going to no longer have the parties hand out the benefits. It's the job of the government through our entitlement programs. Does it weaken the political parties in terms of their reach? Yeah. Does it maybe weaken them appropriately? Probably, right? Could we look at changes to electoral laws? We already really did this, right? Where they don't have a seat at the table and therefore they can't really control the rules of the game, right? So we could look at those. We could certainly look at financing. Do you think third parties are well funded beyond Ross Perot? Typically not, right? And therefore, is that a factor in why they're not more competitive? And then we could kind of look at, our voting mechanisms in themselves, how democratic they are, and things to kind of okay, if we do want to make things more meaningful, maybe we want to think about more than just voting for candidates, right? So just as kind of a quick reminder of things we looked at when we talked about ways to make voting more democratic. is to make sure that the pre-election elections are meaningful and democratic, and there's, again, different forms, you remember? And parties use different strategies, but one way I can make it even more meaningful is to include initiatives and referendums. Do you remember the distinction? In both cases, what am I putting on the ballot?
An issue.
An issue.
Referendums are given from the state legislators to us, and we bring up an issue through initiatives.
We initiate the initiatives, right? Yeah, this is one that you get enough signatures and it gets on the ballot. The legislators would hand us a referendum. Why would they do that? They already have the power to make law.
So they can avoid, like, public.
Yeah, this is like an issue that I'm afraid to take a stance on. Let me get a temperature of the people first, right? So just a few notes. We're going to move to one other thing, but just a few more notes on kind of parties here. It is interesting. They're kind of a little bit of a dichotomy here in that they're kind of amorphous. There's no, like, when you guys register to vote, you can pick a party. They don't send you any swag in the mail, do they? You don't have to all of a sudden start wearing a pin or a button or a magma hat or anything like that, right? It is a fairly informal membership to things. I suppose church could be the same. You could be you could go on Christmas and Easter, or you could not go at all, right? Or you could go every day. The degree to kind of identification really depends on the individual. Yet, as informal as the membership is, people usually kind of feel it fairly intensely. And that's reinforced by the two-party system. It's felt intensely because it really gets down to, I think, your most fundamental sense of security. The party's on the most basic level. If we kind of ignore, I don't mean ignore policy, but if we just kind of look at what the parties stand for at its core, and then kind of use that as a construct to think about where their policy is. Thinking about what the parties are at their core defines what government is and what it's there for. And that's kind of tied to food, clothing, shelter on some way, your sense of security. That's why they've done interesting studies when they look at people's brains when they're talking politics. And they look at what areas light up. And literally the kind of the more Precambrian brain, the reptilian brain, the one that is like, the fight or flight instincts are there and the food, clothing, shelter instincts are there. Those are the ones that are most responsive when we talk politics.
Oh, that wasn't a car, that was, I think, a tree went down.
I think you would have heard it.
I mean, I did just hear it.
Well, I heard the wind, but it might have been a bridge.
Yeah.
Had
Yeah.
a tree going? I thought it hit that.
All right, we'll investigate in a second because I got a little quiz for you we're going to get into here in a second, and that will keep things rolling. All right. So, just in general, use this as a rule of thumb. When you guys looked at what your political identity was, you looked at it based on issues. I guess that's a little better way of saying it earlier. And maybe what I needed you to do is to kind of think first about what do you think is the fundamental role of government, and then see if that approach works for you with the issues that are most important to you. And does the party consistently line up with where you expect it to? All right? So conservatives, typically they believe, and this is, again, big general brushstrokes, that the government that governs the best governs the least. That a concentration of power in the hands of the federal government is going to lead to abuse, and more power means more abuse. Big government largely can only infringe on your individual economic, political, and social rights. There's a strong belief in individuals here, and there, is an idea that individuals can best succeed when there aren't any barriers, and the biggest barrier being kind of the federal government. What do we do though that seems to be a system based on winners and losers then, right? Especially within our capitalist system. So what do you do to help out the ones that are in need? It's not as if they're necessarily heartless and saying, I'm going to take a Darwinian approach. This is social Darwinism. What they believe is that local and state and charitable institutions are better able to handle those problems because large bureaucracies have more waste and less ability to kind of handle those things. These institutions are closer to the people. And one of the major themes is, a fiscal responsibility as well. As the party evolves, in comes that social conservatism as well. But you line up 10 Republicans and they probably, are on the spectrum in 10 different places. Same thing for liberals, right? So take this as a generalization. What do the liberals believe? Well, they tend to believe that the government is the best and most essential safety net. That this is not enough of a guarantee, local and state kind of action. That you have unalienable rights, and a right is a right is a right, and it needs to be safeguarded, it needs to be guaranteed, and the federal government is the best institution to do that. What's interesting is the liberals started off with the idea of liberty, maximizing liberty, and that would mean less government, right? But ultimately, if liberties are threatened, might you need a proactive act of government? If the threat to your liberty isn't the government, but it's racial inequality, economic inequality, states kind of being unequal in terms of what they afford their citizens, would you need a proactive act of government, okay? So on some level, if you start with that, and then you think about that approach with regards to your issues, I think that gets to a more meaningful, deeper political identification, rather than just thinking about issues. Because issues can be temporal. They come and go, right? This should be at the bedrock all this time. That having been said, let's do something trivial. Let's just kind of do a quick run through and see if you guys remember demographic trends as a quiz. He's very anxious to answer. Education. To what degree does it affect voting?
Very high degree.
To a high degree, it is the highest, right? How does it affect voting? Who's more likely, in terms of level of education and party identification, how does it work, Paul?
So it works like this. If you don't have any education, you are more likely to vote Democrat.
Okay, so lower the level of education, the more likely to vote Democrat.
Once you start getting into like higher education, for the most part, it causes you to vote Republican unless you have a PhD.
Good.
Then you vote Democrat.
Okay, so why the higher level of education goes to Republican? What does higher education actually correlate to? That might explain it a little more.
Higher income?
Income, right? Why a PhD? Because like that's a big degree. Don't they have a lot of money, Colin?
Because universities tend to be liberal.
Yeah, and again, I'm generalizing there, but I think that that's maybe a valid argument. That there's by liberal, maybe it's just this idea of the more educated you get, do you think you become maybe a little more altruistic? You see issues as a little more complex. Might see the role of big institutions as being helpful. I'm really generalizing, and it's, I guess just a necessary evil with the class. All right, here's Hermione. She's really anxious to answer. We've already kind of done this one, right? Because we've done education. So obviously, this is going to be a factor in terms of how people vote, in that people vote to protect their pocketbook, right? We tend to vote our wallet. But just generalize for me, high income versus low income.
Republicans high, Democrats low.
Okay, why? Charlie.
Because Democrats have more protections for like low-income
Good.
families and people in poverty.
Yep, they support those programs that provide the safety net.
Yeah,
And the
then
Republicans?
Republicans, emphasis on fiscal responsibility.
Good.
And, like control of your own money.
Good. So then you're going to see that through kind of their tax policy.
Yep.
Pro-business kind of policies in terms of like, again, do we tax income investments differently? What percent of your income is taxed? A third, right? Is it the same for investments?
Oh, no, it's much lower.
Yeah, so again, you're gonna see that we value kind of investments versus labor differently. And, there's a number of business-friendly and kind of investment-friendly, programs and policies. So again, look at the blue going down as income goes up, or conversely, the red line, going up. How about age? Colin?
I think younger people tend to vote less and vote Democrat.
Good. So young people don't vote in the percentage that they vote less. And so if they were to vote in terms of their percentage of population, man, would they have a bigger impact. And you might see kind of policy that favors, education and your issues handled more favorably. The elderly vote, in higher numbers to the degree that their voice is almost outsized, right? If you look at their percentage of the population, and then you look at their percentage of the voting population, they have that outsized kind of impact,
Great
right?
families.
So where do the young people where do the young people tend to support, and what do the elderly tend to support in terms of parties?
So, yeah, young people tend to support Democrats.
Yep.
And older people tend to vote Republican, and I remember because that Winston Churchill quote, if
Yep.
you're not liberal when you're young, you have no heart, and if you're not conservative when you're old, you have no mind.
So it begins to kind of, be the idealism of youth and the idea of, maybe not being as cynical about certain things versus the idea of protecting, your assets.
Right.
Something I always wondered is,
Mr. Lucia, can you please call the main office, Peter Lucia?
Lucia's been lost.
this chart, not necessarily to these exact numbers, but the idea that older people are more conservative and younger people are more liberal, has that been
Always the norm?
Yeah, has that been the norm, or does it just have to do with generations and how the political atmosphere that they grew up in, and this is what's reflecting now?
It certainly was prevalent in the 60s, right? The 50s is maybe more of a kind of a conservative, we're not so disillusioned with government and institutions. I would say that the youth has always been idealistic, but their support of the Democratic Party and liberal issues, you'd want to look at the 60s as kind of the place that got forged. I would argue, the disillusionment after Nixon, the whole 60s kind of counterculture movement, that's where you may begin to see it.
Which was about?
Yep. So, and there's your Winston Churchill quote. How about gender? Tom Brady wants a high five. Who's going to give it to him?
Anyone.
Women are more likely to vote Democrat, men are more likely.
Yeah, and this is, it's not like this huge chasm in terms of the difference, but you do see that. And again, this is where I suppose I get the most uncomfortable with this, because certainly could income trump how a man or a woman votes, right? Like if I'm low income male, maybe I'm more likely to be Democratic than just kind of go with whatever my X and Y chromosomes say, right? Similarly, if you are, a woman, but you are high income or part of another demographic, these, like a evangelical, a person from the Bible Belt, those things might override. But in general, being, obviously hating these kind of labels, why would women be more likely to vote Democratic and men be more likely to vote Republican? What do you think, Kerrigan?
Kind of more caring about social issues and healthcare and education.
Yeah, so again, it might be by nature or nurture, it might, and I don't know if that necessarily matters, but on some level there may be societal explanations to explain why women might be more altruistic, by default often. I'll give you a quick example. My kids had not a snow day today, like a power outage day today, and my wife and I just equally could have stayed home. On some level, we should have equally stayed home, but she was able to work from home from a laptop, I'm not, and that really was our kind of deciding factor. But you think in most households it goes that way? Is the woman often the de facto caretaker if the kids need to be homesick or something like that? So it's there societally, perhaps, right? How about men? Why would they be more likely to vote Republican? Again, it might be societal. I know we're reluctant to kind of say these things out loud, perhaps, and maybe that's a good sign. What do you think?
Maybe they're perceived as being tougher, so they're not gonna bend to.
Yeah, there's that kind of societal trend to being more individualistic. Even in foreign policy, is there kind of a macho approach? This kind of idea of a robust response to kind of foreign threats, that the hawkish kind of approach that appeals, right? I was running out of people with hands up, so I just picked Beyonce because she looked like she was raising her hand.
So she's not Jewish.
No, and again, there was no correlation to who I picked and why, but I just thought that this was this was a good image. Where do the Jewish people tend to kind of vote? What party?
Democrat.
Democrat. How come?
For historical reasons.
Meaning?
Relating to the Holocaust, they're often.
So one thing that is central to their identity, more so than an identification with Israel as a home state, is the history of persecution. And how does that play in with the Democratic Party?
Because the Democratic Party, oftentimes, they're more so helpful than the Republican Party to minority groups.
Yeah.
Or people who are.
So if you've got a history of persecution, that leads to perhaps a sympathy with the disenfranchised, and the Democratic Party has more policies, or more support for policies that seem to support that. That obviously is kind of a major factor, this idea of, it's in the Christian faith obviously as well, this idea of, the values of kind of justice and equality and helping out, that's in both of them, right? And again, the Republican Party has a staunch support for Israel, but that isn't always as central to the identity. It may pull the 22% that do support the Republican Party, they're more likely to be Orthodox, and that may kind of correlate to the idea of having a heightened identification with Israel as the homeland. How about Catholic? This one is a more historic identity. Yeah, there's Kanye.
Democrat.
Historically more Democratic. Why?
See, like when the second wave of immigration came, it was a lot of like Eastern.
Yep.
Yeah, a lot of Eastern European.
And so where are they income-wise?
They're more the lower class at the time, so they were getting more of the benefits from the
Yep.
Democratic groups.
Okay? So historically, you're going to see them, again, you can look at the religion and you could look at the religious values and you could see how that lines up with the idea of the government as a safety net, helping out the disenfranchised and less fortunate. And they were more likely to be the disenfranchised and lower income groups because they were part of that second wave of immigration. This, however, over generations starts to kind of fade. And does the Republican stance on social issues cause a pivot to the Republican Party? In part, yes. But is the church's stance on social issues and the practitioner's stance on social issues the same? You may see Catholics that are supporting the Democratic Party regardless of abortion, because that is not their number one issue. So kind of keep in mind that that's a complexity, and these two groups are kind of, it's hard to generalize about Catholics now, but there's reasons you could see them supporting either party. Protestants? Where are the Protestants?
They vote Republican.
Tend to vote Republican, right? How come? What have I taught you about the Protestant Reformation and what's that?
From what I remember of the Protestant Reformation, is it's more of a independent sort of faith.
Yep, that kind of idea of I can determine my own salvation,
Right.
faith in divine grace alone, the emphasis on the Protestant work ethic, that idleness is wickedness, and that individually you should always kind of work hard. The judgy part of it in terms of like no drinking, no dancing, no playing cards, no showy dress can kind of eventually be seen as an emphasis on social issues. And then there's economics to it. The first wave were the kind of the Protestants from those not northern, but Western kind of European countries. It explains their economic success, right? We'll do race and ethnicity here in a
I was
second.
gonna ask, so it's a very, I know Protestants are very independent faith, so they have priests.
Well, I mean, ministers and not priests, but ministers and pastors. There's, by some count, like 30,000 different denominations within the Protestant faith. So it's
But it's not like the same hierarchical structure as the Catholic Church.
No.
You've got priests.
no. They would call the Roman Catholics papists. You follow the Pope, and that on some level was like that's too much of a concentration of power.
Right.
I got that.
Yes. All right. So last one, race and ethnicity.
Minority groups go Democratic, majority, like white Caucasians go Republican.
What is kind of at the base of that?
Income.
Income, right? More or less. All right. And then again, you're gonna see it just kind of reflected there in the numbers. All right. So I go like this. We say goodbye to Katie.
See you, Katie.